After 40 years of loyalty, they fired her at 65. But what she did after made them regret it forever. This might be the best story you'll hear today. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The rain hammered against the chapel windows like angry fists, each drop exploding into 1,000 tears on the glass. Helen Margaret stood in the back pew, her weathered hands gripping a tissue that had long since dissolved into useless fragments. The black dress she wore, borrowed from a neighbor, hung loose on her thin frame, making her appear even smaller than her 65 years suggested. Before her polished mahogany gleamed under fluorescent lights, containing the man who had been her employer, her friend, and perhaps the only person who truly understood her worth. Arthur Whitman lay silent now, his gentle hands folded across a chest that would never again rise with laughter at her stories from the classroom. The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and regret. Helen's eyes traced the empty chairs around her, so few mourners for a man who had touched so many lives. But then she saw him. Marcus Whitman strode through the chapel doors like he owned the very air, his charcoal suit pristine, his jaw set in that familiar expression of contempt she'd grown to dread. His eyes found hers across the rows of empty seats, and something cold passed between them, a promise of what was to come. "Well, well," Marcus's voice cut through the chapel's reverent silence as he approached her pew. The faithful servant weeping. For her master. How touching. His words dripped with sarcasm, each syllable carefully chosen to wound. Helen felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her gaze fixed on the casket. "Tell me, Miss Helen," he continued, settling into the pew beside her with deliberate invasion of her space, "what exactly are you mourning? The end of your free ride, the loss of your meal ticket?" Helen's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "I'm mourning a good man, Mr. Marcus. Your father was—" "My father was a fool," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising enough to echo off the chapel walls. "A sentimental old fool who let a washed-up schoolteacher play house in his home for 20 years. Do you know what that cost him, what it cost our family?" His laugh was bitter hollow. "But that's over now. The fantasy ends today." The next morning arrived grey and merciless, matching Helen's mood, as she stood in the kitchen of the Whitman estate one final time. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual: Earl Grey tea at precisely 8 o'clock, 2 sugars, served in the china cup with the blue roses that Arthur had favored. The routine had become sacred to her, a small act of devotion that made her feel useful, needed. The steam rose from the teapot like incense, carrying with it 20 years of memories. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately poisoning the kitchen's warmth. "Still playing house, I see," he sneered, leaning against the doorframe with casual cruelty. "Tell me, do you actually believe you were anything more than hired help? Because I have news for you. The help is being let go." Helen set down the teapot with trembling hands. "Your father never made me feel like help," she said quietly. "He treated me like family." "Family?" Marcus's laughter was sharp enough to cut glass. "You were a charity case, a broken-down teacher with nowhere else to go. My father pitied you, nothing more. And now that he's gone, the pity ends too." The afternoon. Sun cast long shadows through the estate's windows as Helen packed her meager belongings into a single weathered suitcase. Each item told a story. The scarf Arthur had given her last Christmas, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, the photo of her third-grade class from 1986. Their young faces bright with possibility, the thank-you notes from students whose lives she'd touched before everything fell apart. Marcus watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, his satisfaction evident. 20 years, he mused aloud, and this is all you have to show for it, a suitcase full of memories and failures. How pathetic. But it was his next words that truly shattered her. "You know, I remember when you first came here. My mother was still alive then, still watching you circle around my father like a vulture. She used to cry about it, about how you'd stolen her place in his affections. She died knowing her husband cared more about his pet teacher than his own wife." Helen's hand stilled on her packing. "That's not true," she whispered. "Your mother was ill. I was just—" "You were a predator," Marcus finished coldly. "And now you're nothing but a has-been with delusions of grandeur. Pack faster. I want you gone before dark, and I never want to see your face again. Because honestly, Looking at you just reminds me of everything weak and pathetic about my father's final years." As Helen walked down the estate's long driveway for the last time, her suitcase heavy in her arthritic hand, she could feel Marcus watching from an upstairs window. The iron gates that had welcomed her for 2 decades now seemed to mock her departure, their ornate scrollwork spelling out a life that was never really hers. She paused at the sidewalk, looking back at the only home she'd known since her divorce, since her teaching career had crumbled, since she'd lost everything that mattered. The fee. Late afternoon sun painted the mansion's windows gold, but all Helen saw was the end of everything. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has gone through a sudden devastating loss that changed everything overnight? Share your thoughts in the comments. But sometimes, the end of one story is merely the beginning of another. As Helen sat in the cramped studio apartment she'd managed to rent with her savings, a far cry from her spacious room at the estate, she discovered something unexpected among Arthur's final papers. The elderly lawyer, Mr. Benjamin Clark, had called her 3 days after the funeral, with news that would change everything. "Helen," his voice was gentle over the phone, "Arthur left specific instructions. He wanted you to have something, not money, not property, but something far more valuable. He believed in your gift, and he's given you the means to share it with the world." The manila envelope contained more than just Arthur's final wishes. It contained his faith in her. Inside were detailed plans for a scholarship foundation seed, money carefully saved and invested over years, and a letter in Arthur's familiar handwriting that brought tears to her eyes. "My dear Helen," it read, "you never stopped being a teacher even when the world convinced you otherwise. Every story you shared, every lesson you taught me about patience and kindness, every moment you helped me remember the joy in learning, these were your classroom. Now it's time for a bigger classroom one, where your gifts can touch lives the way you've touched mine." Within weeks, Helen found herself sitting across from eager young faces again, not in a traditional classroom, but in community centers, libraries, and neighborhood halls throughout Chicago. The Helen Whitman Foundation for Educational Excellence had become her new beginning, providing tutoring and mentorship for struggling students whose stories echoed her own journey through difficulty and disappointment. Her first student was Maria, a 12-year-old whose parents worked 3 jobs between them and who struggled with reading. "I'm stupid," Maria had declared on their first meeting, her eyes defiant but wounded. Helen recognized that look. She'd worn it herself after her marriage failed, after her teaching position was eliminated, after Marcus had made her feel worthless. "Stupid," Helen repeated gently, settling beside Maria at the small table in the community center. "Let me tell you about stupid. Stupid is what people call us when they can't see our potential. Stupid is what they say when they give up on us. But you and I were not stupid. We're just getting started." She opened a well-worn copy of Charlotte's Web, the same book she'd read to countless third-graders years ago. "Let's discover what words can do when we give them a chance." The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was miraculous. Maria's eyes began to light up as letters formed words, words formed sentences, and sentences formed stories that transported her beyond the cramped apartment she shared with her family. Other students followed. Antonio, who struggled with math until Helen showed him how numbers could build bridges and solve puzzles. Sarah, whose dyslexia had convinced her teachers she'd never read fluently. Jamie, whose attention challenges melted away when Helen discovered his passion for astronomy and taught him to read through star charts and space stories. Helen's reputation grew quietly but steadily through Chicago's neighborhoods. Parents whispered her name in grocery store lines. Teachers recommended her in faculty meetings, and children begged to join her after-school sessions. The foundation's small headquarters, 2 rented rooms above a bakery, became a beacon of hope. Helen worked 18-hour days, but each moment felt like purpose reclaimed. She was 65 years old and had never felt more alive, more needed, more herself. One evening, as Helen locked up the foundation offices after a particularly successful day, 3 students had achieved grade-level reading for the first time, she found an unexpected visitor waiting by her car. Marcus Whitman stood in the dim streetlight, but this wasn't the arrogant man who had dismissed her months ago. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, and his eyes held something she'd never seen there before: uncertainty. "We need to talk," he said simply, his voice lacking its usual venom. They sat in Helen's modest Honda, the silence stretching between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Finally, Marcus spoke his words, coming slowly, carefully. "I've been watching you," he admitted, "following your work with the Foundation. I didn't believe it at first, that you could build something real, something that mattered. I thought it was just another one of your delusions." He turned to look at her directly. "But I was wrong. About a lot of things." "The house feels empty," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Not just because my father's gone, but because something essential is missing. You knew him in ways I never bothered to learn. You saw his kindness, his intelligence, his humor, all the things I dismissed as weakness." His hands gripped the steering wheel of his own car parked beside them. "I found his journals last week. 20 years of entries about you, about how proud he was of your teaching, how you helped him remember what it meant to care about learning, about growing, about becoming better. He wrote that you never stopped being a teacher, even when the world told you to stop, especially then." Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope. "This is for the Foundation," he said, his voice thick with emotion he'd clearly been suppressing for months. "It's not charity, and it's not guilt. Money, it's an investment in what you're building, what my father believed in, what I was too proud and angry to see." He paused, struggling with words that had never come easily to him. "And it's an apology. Not just for how I treated you after the funeral, but for 20 years of resentment, jealousy, and blindness. You weren't taking my father away from me. You were showing him how to be the man he always wanted to be. And somehow in all of that you were teaching me too, even when I refused to learn." Helen looked at the envelope, then at Marcus's face, seeing for the first time the lost boy behind the bitter man. "Your father used to talk about you," she said gently. "He was so proud, so worried, so hopeful. He wanted you to find your own way to make a difference in the world. Maybe this is how." She smiled, and for the first time in their long acquaintance, Marcus smiled back, tentatively but genuinely. "The Foundation could use a board member with business experience, someone who understands both success and failure, pride and humility. Someone ready to learn." 6 months later, the Helen Whitman Foundation had expanded to 5 locations across Chicago, serving over 200 students and families. Helen stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Chicago, accepting the Mayor's Award for Educational Innovation. In the audience sat Maria, now reading at grade level, and dreaming of college Antonio, who had just won the city's middle school mathematics competition, and Sarah, whose poetry had been published in the school literary magazine. Beside them sat Marcus, his face glowing with pride, not for his own achievements, but for the woman he'd once dismissed as worthless. As Helen held the Crystal Award, feeling its weight and warmth, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a failed marriage, to a lost teaching position, from 20 years of quiet service, to public humiliation and dismissal, from despair to purpose, reclaimed and multiplied. The girl who had once dreamed of changing the world through teaching had become a woman who was doing exactly that, not in spite of her failures and losses, but because of them. Every setback had taught her empathy, every disappointment had deepened her compassion, every moment of feeling worthless had prepared her to recognize and nurture worth in others. Helen's acceptance speech was brief but powerful. "They say that those who can do and those who can't teach. I say that those who teach do the most important work of all. They multiply possibility. Every student who learns to read doesn't just gain a skill, they gain access to every story ever told, every idea ever shared, every dream ever written down. Today I stand before you not as someone who was discarded, but as someone who was refined. Not as someone who failed, but as someone who learned that failure is just success that hasn't found its proper classroom yet. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to begin again, and that the most beautiful chapters of our lives often start with the words, 'the end.'" As the applause thundered around her, Helen caught Marcus's eye in the audience. He was clapping harder than anyone, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what his father had seen in the quiet woman who had never stopped believing in the power of second chances, the magic of patient teaching, and the eternal truth that every person, no matter how broken, how old, how forgotten, has something invaluable to offer the world. The only question is whether we're brave enough to help them find it, wise enough to nurture it, and generous enough to celebrate it when it blooms. Congratulations, type 7 in the comments, so I know you stayed with me until the end. Leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. See you.